Hello and welcome. I'm Reija, and you are watching my channel, The Bookfinch, and this is a catch-up live stream of the Shorts and Sorcery book club that I run every month. And because of various things, like the fact that I have had to move house and I've been traveling, um, I am just now getting into the groove of doing a catch-up live show for the months of July and August, respectively. So you are watching this on September 11th, and it is currently 9 o'clock in Finland. So this this evening we will be. Oh, hello, Joe. Nice of you to join. So this evening I am going to be talking about Uncanny Magazine issue 45 and Where the Whale is Thin. Uncanny Magazine issue 45 was the July magazine pick for the book club, and Where the Whale is Thin was the anthology pick for August. So also in May, we had a bit of a skip month. So that is why I had to move the timeline a bit forward. So, for example, we had 2 months to read The Way Spring Arrives and Other Stories earlier this year, where normally we would have 1 month per thing. So Uncanny was for July, and Where the Whale is Thin was for August. And I'm also, at the end of this live show, going to touch upon a little bit about our September read as well. So first of all, I'm going to talk about Uncanny issue 45. This was really interesting. I actually felt that normally I am very much more in tune with the nonfiction selection of each short story magazine that I read. That is usually the thing that gets me most excited. In anthologies as well, if there is nonfiction essays included, those are the things that usually make me very happy because I love literature analysis. I love all sorts of like meta exploration of genre fiction from a sort of like academic sense, if that makes sense, which is also why I love panels and panel discussions so much. But I have to say that the essays in this particular issue were not the standout for me. I actually felt that I liked a lot of the short stories better, which is good, but just not something that I was actually expecting. I was expecting to really like love the nonfiction stuff. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit about the nonfiction first, and then I'm going to uh, talk about my favorite short fiction in this collection or in this magazine. And so there was this nonfiction essay called "The Yearning Body Problem" by Meg Ellison, and it was all about like escapism and yearning and how different types of media can have an effect on people, and how we sort of like use media as an outlet for our yearning, especially during the time of the pandemic when this was like written. This is really like exploring that idea of how we were isolated and how we used media as an outlet during a time when we felt really isolated and out of touch with other people. I personally did not like this all that much because it touches upon very specific types of yearning, a very specific type of media. It talks about Pride and Prejudice. It talks about these very specific types of games, etc. So if you are not someone who is into that particular type of fiction, or that particular type of media, then this essay really does not relate to any of your personal experiences. So that is why I think this was a very niche essay. Like, it wants to touch upon a universal topic, but it doesn't quite get there because the viewpoint that it chooses is very like narrowed down to a very specific type of fiction that people enjoy. So that was one thing. Um, the other thing, obviously, there's the Ask a Unicorn section by the Uncanny Unicorn, which is basically like a Q&A section that is every month in the Uncanny Magazine, or every time they have an issue out, there is this sort of Ask a Unicorn section. So that's your standard basic Q&A, nothing to really write home about. But also, the one essay that I actually really liked was Acknowledging Taiwanese American Vampire Foodies by Joe Wu. And what I liked about this one, it sort of acknowledges this idea of how we view uh, cuisine and culinary culture, and the culinary arts and food of other cultures, and how sometimes there's this idea that other cultures are lesser. For example, food cultures that include the use of intestines and blood in their diet. For example, in Finland, there's this very controversial and opinion dividing food called the black sausage, which is made out of blood and sort of like rice and barley. And then there is the blood pancakes, etc. So I felt really like I could relate to this essay, because it discusses this idea of like colonialism, and who gets to decide what is sort of fashionable and on trend and acceptable as food, and acceptable as being worthy of praise and worthy of being sort of put on a pedestal and put on this like sort of place of higher culture, where obviously this essay deals with the idea of like uh, Asian, and especially like Southeast Asian and Chinese food and Taiwanese food being like viewed as lesser in some aspects, and also how due to immigration to other countries, it is made palatable to that culture where the persons are immigrating to. And for example, you have Chinese restaurants that have a very catered to the the location where they're in. You basically have people adapting their food culture in a way that is palatable to the general audience. So I thought that that was a very interesting, um, interesting topic and interesting essay. So actually, I would recommend, like, if you pick any of the essays in this particular magazine, I would say that you should definitely read the Acknowledging Taiwanese American Vampire Foodies, because it was a really touching and thought-provoking essay specifically about food culture and how we view uh, food in different cultures. And then there was also Wax Sealed with a Kiss and Resisting the Monolith, collecting as counter narrative. So Wax Sealed with a Kiss was by Elsa Schuneson, and this is basically about the idea of correspondence and slow correspondence, especially, and letter writing as a form of romance and dating, and how much you can put in a letter. And as a person who really likes writing letters, this was, I thought, a really good like introduction to this. Like this is sort of like for the person who has not written letters. This is kind of a sales pitch. So for me, for that specific reason, it didn't do much, because I already write letters and I exchange correspondence with friends, and I send like, especially to my friends in other countries, I send a lot of like correspondence in forms of Christmas cards and birthday cards, etc. So for me, this didn't do much, but I can see it being a very valuable sort of look into a perspective in slow correspondence for someone who doesn't do it already. And Resisting the Monolith, Collecting as a Counter Narrative by Rebecca Romney is all about like book collecting, and specifically rare book collecting, and how that has a sort of um, impact on how we can basically like upheld traditions and stories that are being lost by way of collecting them and way of like passing the information forward to other people. And it's sort of like it's all about like rare book collecting and also sharing these different types of editions and documenting them and digitizing them, etc., etc. So I thought that was really interesting. But my favorite nonfiction essay in this magazine, as said, was acknowledging Taiwanese American vampire foodies. So that is my recommendation from this magazine for nonfiction. Now, in terms of stories in this magazine, there were a lot, which I will try to be as concise as possible because I'm hoping to, as we are discussing two things in this live show, I'm hoping to do this in an hour's time. So I will be very limited. Um, I will pick, let's say, 4 of my favorite short stories because I also want to tease something. I also want you to be able to pick this magazine up and go to read it. You can purchase it from Uncanny Magazine or you can read some of the stories there. I definitely would recommend Uncanny Magazine in terms of like the quality of stories. Like sometimes some stories are like hit or miss for me. That is the case with all magazines, but I do think that Uncanny does a fabulous job in incorporating various different perspectives and including a very like diverse roster of authors. So one story that I really liked was Boundless by Miyuki Jane Pinkard. And this is a sapphic queer lesbian love story between a married couple who are both astronauts. One is retired and one is on active duty. And it kind of reminds me of the movie Interstellar because it kind of deals with this idea of like what happens when your wife, your partner, leaves on a long interstellar mission and disappears, and with picking up the pieces and left with this yearning and grief because you're not really sure what happened. You know that they're missing, so there's always that nagging chance that they might come back, right? But there's also a very high chance because it is space travel that they might be dead. So it deals with this sort of in between, this limbo state of this idea that you are grieving for a lost spouse, but also like not really able to let go of this hope that they might be alive. And the speculative aspect of the story comes in when the main character starts sort of hearing these sort of messages, this sort of like radio static of her wife trying to contact her, and it is not really clear whether this is something that she is imagining because of her grief or if it is something that is actually happening. So it really reminded me of the Interstellar movie, and I really liked the introspective nature of it. So that's one story that I really liked, Boundless by Miyuki Jane Pinkard. And it's also a very bittersweet story and open-ended as well, which I really liked. I like that when stories don't really tell you everything there is to know, they leave you with just enough to let your own imagination run wild and kind of do a lot of like your own interpretations. I really like that about stories, and this one definitely did. The other one I really liked was The Kaleidoscopic Visitor by Shawnee C. White. This is basically a climate fiction short story, but it is also about finding yourself and finding the strength to embrace your true self. It is about trans joy. The main character is transgender, and they're sort of like figuring out how to navigate this, how to present themselves, and how to accept themselves first and foremost. It isn't about others accepting you. It is about finding the courage to finally take the first steps towards being your being your own true self. And I really liked this idea of the kaleidoscopic visitor because it is kind of like this almost a genie, a fairy type figure who is made out of like these prismatic like mirror shards. You don't really know what they look like. They don't have any like specified gender or anything, so they're just them. And it kind of like is a perfect idea, this perfect representation of an entity that can grant someone their deepest wish, this deepest wish to be who they are. And it also deals with this idea of respectability and how the things we most desire and what we most want out of life may not necessarily be the most socially acceptable, and that they don't have to be socially acceptable. You don't have to live your life um, in a way that is palatable to others. And I found that really interesting, that the way the kaleidoscopic visitor is at first portrayed is sort of almost as a villain, and then it gets turned over on its head, and you kind of see other aspects of them, and you find out that there's more to them than meets the eye. So the kaleidoscopic visitor by Shawnee C. White is another favorite, which I really liked. And then The Path of Water by Emma Törtz was also fantastic. This is basically about this idea of like what happens when a fairy tale comes to an end, when the characters in a fairy tale get their happily ever after. What happens? Because usually it is fade to black, and you see the text like they lived happily ever after, but do they really? And this is basically a story about this trope of you have the prince, you have the princess, they get married, um, but you also have the sort of witch character, and it is all about like navigating this idea of these roles in a fairy tale, who gets to play them, what they mean, and also this idea of trauma, of like if you wake up from a 100-year slumber, uh, and don't remember a lot that happened to you in the past, like how do you deal with it, how do you navigate about finding what really happened and finding answers, and also finding solace and consolation in your existence, because like you are essentially you're taking on this role that has been pushed on you through narrative, through a fairy tale, and that is not necessarily who you are as a person. So I like that it deals with the idea of consequences of this sort of like long narrative, like a fairy tale. You like something happened, um, a princess was woken with a kiss. They were asleep 100 years. The prince might have been a beast of some kind. Like what kind of trauma, what kind of um, wounds does that leave on a person? I really like that. I do think that in this case, the open-endedness was not done as well as, for example, with Boundless, because you're kind of like given this. You're kind of given this idea of like this is what the world is like, but you're not given all the details. And I think you're not given enough details to really appreciate the open-endedness. So I think that in some cases it might have become a little bit alienating and sort of confusing, but I still like the journey, and I especially liked the narrative voice. This has a very interesting narrative voice that I really enjoyed, and I would definitely want to read more stories from this author, because this made me really curious about what other kinds of stories might um, they might write. So, A Path of Water, the Path of Water by Emma Törtz was really good, and I um, really liked it. And okay, what other stories do we have here? Oh, I actually really liked Flower Kicker by Stephen Graham Jones. This is also this is a horror short story, and this was relatively like this was one of the shorter stories in the magazine, and I actually really enjoyed it. This was the first time I have ever read anything by Stephen Graham Jones, and I think it was a good introduction. You essentially immediately knew that this was a sort of horror story, but the hook was very different for me because it is told from the perspective of the, well, would-be villain, would-be hero. We are never really quite sure, uh, but I really enjoyed the journey we took with this character. There were a lot of like interesting turns. There's like uh, a sheer like terror that this character themselves feels about finding out what is going on. And when you do find out, it is kind of gut wrenching for both you as the reader and the main character, if that makes sense. I won't tell you much more about it because it is definitely on the like you really need to read it first of all to appreciate it, and to say more would be to spoil the main hook of the story, so I don't want to do that. What I want you to do is to go and read it, and especially like try out this magazine, because I thought that this was such a cool issue. And there's also a pretty lengthy interview with Paul Lewin, who is the artist behind the cover for this issue. And I personally really like Paul Lewin's artwork for the covers of Uncanny Magazine. Like I like Paul Lewin as an artist nonetheless. I follow them on Twitter as well. Like his art is fantastic. He recently got to do a mural um, in like for like a city. I think it was a university or something. They did like a huge mural with their like Afrofuturistic style, and I really like that. So definitely I would want to recommend this magazine. I had a lot of fun time with it. And then next, I want to talk a bit about Where the Whale is Thin, edited by Cerise Rennie Murphy and Alana Jolie Abbott. And this anthology had stories by Jim Hines, Glenn Parris, Shannon Maguire, C.S.E. Cooney, Shanna Swenson, Gwendolyn and Nix, David Ball, Zin E. Rocklin. So it had a lot of like interesting stories from various different people. And I have to say, I personally was very drawn by this particular anthology by the cover, because the cover is beautiful, it looks stunning, and I'm also someone who is very particular and partial to fairies and fairy tales. And I wanted to include at least one anthology in this book club that is about fairy tales and fairy tales specifically. I will say that this is most likely the closest that I have come to consider um, an anthology that I picked as a sort of not failure in a sense, but this now that I have read this anthology, I might not necessarily have picked it. In these sort of like hindsight is 2020 type of terms, because I wanted an anthology that was about fairies and fairy tales and subverting fairy tales, and that was sort of leaning into the diversity and who gets to tell fairy tales and who gets to tell what type of fairy tales. Because for like the modern Western global North audience, fairy tales are often very white and dominated by sort of like white European culture. And unfortunately, this anthology sort of leans into that. There are amazing stories in here, or at least very good stories in here by diverse creators such as Zin E. Rocklin, who is a Black author. But they are sort of, I think, few and far between, and a lot of the time the stories sort of lean into more of the Western archetypes that we are used to. So in that case, this anthology didn't really do anything new. Um, and that is a shame, because that was actually the thing that I was really expecting and hoping from this anthology, was that it would try out something new and introduce new types of fairy tales and new types of tropes for readers to enjoy. Um, and also, there are a couple of ways to enjoy this anthology: the physical version and the ebook version, for example. And I have to say that, having read the ebook version, I would probably have to recommend you go the physical route if you want to pick this anthology up, because the way the ebook is formatted is pretty poor. There are some text formatting issues. For example, sometimes the text cuts in random intervals, and also there are these code blocks of like hashtag number garbage piled on top of a word. So you get the first syllable of a word, then there is a code block of like number, like random number generated things, and then the rest of the word. So it kind of like pulls you out of the story when you're reading it, because you're constantly having to like navigate through these formatting issues. The original like physical version is also illustrated, so like there are these title page illustrations, and also like one story is um sort of like choose your own adventure story, where you are encouraged to go back and forth in the story, and also like make notes on this sort of table of contents for that story. And those are not presented in the ebook version at all, at least not the one that I was reading. So just a heads up that the formatting of the ebook is not the best, and you will probably struggle a lot while reading it. So I would go the physical route for reading this book, because the ebook reading was a chore. And I don't know if it's because of that, that the formatting was just so difficult to get through, or because it was the stories, but I had a hard time reading this, and I had a harder time getting into the stories than I would uh, otherwise. Um, for example, the story sort of starts, the stories start with the Tooth Fairies by Glenn Paris, which is kind of like a sort of fantastical story told from the villain's point of view, where the Tooth Fairies are essentially kind of vampires, and they are going to this house to snag a child's tooth, and what happens to them. And it was so sort of basic that I couldn't really get into it. And because that was sort of the story that was the starter, which was getting you into the it was getting you into the vibe and the general like atmosphere of the anthology. So having that as the first story, and that not really uh, working for me, was a huge minus, basically, because then every other story kind of like had that um, as the template. That said, there were cool stories in this, so I'm gonna talk about a couple. Um, the first one that I really liked was The Last Home of Master Tranquil Cloud by Min-Soo Kang. This was essentially all about this sort of like Asian sort of like cultivation type short story short story. It deals with like nine-tailed like fox spirits, essentially, about like murdered women becoming fox spirits, and this entanglement they have with this one scholar. And I thought that that was one of the more interesting stories, and it deals with a fairy tale and a sort of like fairy tale trope that is not like it is fairly common nowadays, but it did something like really interesting with it that I liked. So that was one of the better stories in my opinion, The Last Home of Master Tranquil Cloud by Min-Soo Kang. And the second story that I really liked was Old Twelvey Night by Gwendolyn N. Nix. This is basically about an orchard and a sort of dryad living inside an apple tree and how she needs to defend her orchard and her apple tree from a blight, and the blight is basically caused by these mischievous fairies. And I thought that that was an interesting take. It was kind of action packed. There was also some queer yearning and a sapphic romance, and it was all about kind of corruption. So that was an interesting story, I thought. And then I really liked Or Perhaps Up by C.S.E. Cooney. And this is a story about death, dying, and grief. And you're not really sure ever where the main character is. Like, have they become a sort of water ghost? Or is this some sort of like limbo of the afterlife? Like, they're not truly dead? You never really find out, but the like atmosphere and imagery of the story is very different, and I really like that. It's very confusing at times. There's a lot to be interpreted with it, uh, but it was unique in its voice, its character voice, and also the way it presented the world. So yeah, those were some of my favorites. I didn't personally like the sort of find your own, like choose your own adventure story, which was Your Two Better Halves, A Dream with Fairies in Spanglish by Carlos Hernandez, partially due to the formatting issues in the ebook, but also due to the fact that it was just so long, and it felt like Hernandez had written like these snippets, and when you were going through the story, they didn't really like hold together and make sense in a way that is needed for a choose your own adventure story to work. So that's why I did not really like it, and it didn't entice me to go back and read the story multiple times, where normally a choose your own adventure story, you need a hook that really makes you want to like go through the adventure multiple times. So that was a little bit of a miss. Um, I also thought that the story by Shannon Maguire, which was all about like this humorous, basically sort of department store Walmart employee getting whisked away to a magical world by a unicorn and a lady, and I felt like if I had not read Across the Green Grass Fields just a few weeks earlier, I probably wouldn't have minded. But now I basically just can see Shannon Maguire's like repetition. Like the way she kind of like lifts certain like sentences word for word from other stories that she has written. It becomes, the more you read from her, the more like blatant it becomes. So I feel like this anthology had a lot of really like interesting stories, but it also had a lot of like huge misses for me. So overall it was very much like for every story that I really liked, there was a story that I really didn't, and that was unfortunate. Um, so I'm glad that I read it. I'm glad that I read this anthology, but at the same time, it kind of makes me. It kind of gives me new insight on what kind of books I should choose for this book club, and also like uh, that I need to do my due diligence to look more carefully into the types of books that I'm choosing for the book club, so that the books themselves are more enjoyable for the general book club audience to enjoy. I personally, as an if I were to look at this from a non-book club hoster perspective, if I had read this, I probably would have DNF'd. As I am moderating and hosting the book club, obviously I had to read the whole thing, and um, I felt that from my perspective, at least, this was not the strongest choice I could have made, and therefore I need to be more diligent about what to choose next time. So That said, Where the Whale is Thin has probably been my least favorite thing that I have read for this book club. And I'm actually thinking of doing a kind of um, after December, when I've had like a full year of this book club, I'm gonna do like a retrospective and ranking from best or from like least best to best uh, um, picks for the book club. Because I want to sort of hold myself accountable and also share my thoughts on what I thought. So that will definitely be a video, a Shorts and Sorcery retrospective about ranking all of the books that we read during this first year. So that was Where the Whale is Thin. I'm actually not surprised that I didn't have as much to say about this anthology because unfortunately I did not really end up liking it all that much. So with that, before I stop this live show, I'm just gonna talk a little bit about what we are going to be reading for September. So September, we are reading the Future Science Fiction Digest issue 15, and this includes basically short stories from China, Ukraine, Greece, and oh my God, what was the other one? I think at least China, Greece, and Ukraine are represented here. And this is a bit of a shorter magazine. It only has like a foreword and then the 4 stories. So I think it is very accessible to new readers, and also it is readable completely free on the website of Future Science Fiction Digest. So if you have not already started reading, you can read it for free. But also, if you are able, please do consider supporting the magazine with buying a digital copy, because all of these magazines, Uncanny, Future Science Fiction Digest, Choreo, they are all run by donations and purchases of readers like you, and also they are run by volunteers. Like obviously, for a lot of people, it is also a full-time job, but this is like purchasing the issues really makes a difference in these authors' livelihoods. So if you are financially able, please consider always supporting the magazines. That said, Future Science Fiction Digest issue 15 is what we are reading in September. And I have linked in this live show's description, there is a link to the website where you can read the magazine, and also a link to the Goodreads discussion group. So yeah, that is basically the catch-up live show for Shorts and Sorcery book club this month. So that was our picks for July, which was Uncanny Magazine issue 45, and our pick for August, which was Where the Whale is Thin. And I made it just in time, 40 minutes. I was estimating an hour, but as I am hosting this by myself, I usually don't have as much to talk about as opposed to if I was hosting this with someone else. So thank you for joining me. And if you like this, please consider giving it a thumbs up. Please consider joining the Goodreads group, and also joining on the discussions of and choosing to read the various picks, various books that I have picked for the Shorts and Sorcery Book Club. This is all about reading short stories, anthologies, and short fiction. And yeah, and I hope I will see you next time, and I hope I will see you in the book club during September as we read issue 15 of Science Fiction Future Digest. And the next live show for Shorts and Sorcery book club should be in about a month. Um, Usually, I'm trying to host these on the first Saturday of each consecutive month. So for next month, that would most likely be Saturday of 1st of October. However, considering how late I got the the discussion post up, I am thinking that Saturday 8th of October is more likely to be the next live show for Shorts and Sorcery book club. So without further ado, I will let you get back to your Sunday and enjoy the rest of your weekend and your reading. Bye bye!